Welcome, everybody, to Talkback, a virtual town hall for Ontario to discuss intimate partner violence. I'm Kristyn Wong-Tam, the MPP for Toronto Centre, as well as the Shadow Attorney General for the official opposition, Ontario NDP. I'm going to hand everything right over now to Alexa Gilmour, who is going to provide a land acknowledgement.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Alexa Gilmour. I am the MPP for Parkdale High Park and the Shadow Minister for Women's Social and Economic Opportunities. And we are so grateful that so many of you are making time tonight for this important conversation. We want to start our meeting in a very good way by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples whose traditional territory we have gathered on today. So this acknowledgement is for Toronto, where I am, and if you are joining us from elsewhere, we invite you to put that in the chat or in your heart and hold that space. Because for thousands of years, this land has been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississauga of the Credit River. And this territory is also subject to the dish with one spoon wampum, a covenant originally made between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and everyone who shares this territory eats out of the same dish with only one spoon. And we have a collective responsibility to ensure that the dish is never empty. With these reflections in mind, I'd ask that we bring our hearts and our minds together in a shared purpose, and that we commit ourselves to the ongoing process of reconciliation. We also want to acknowledge that these lands that we are upon are being honored in the time of February, Black History Month. So we honor and acknowledge the long-standing and disproportionate impact that intimate partner violence has had and continues to have on Black, Indigenized, racialized girls, women, and gender-diverse people. Kristyn, I want you to invite us into the next part.
Thank you very much, Alexa. I want to begin by just letting people know you would have been advised coming into the room that we are recording today's webinar. And the purpose of the recording is to make sure that there's a record of this conversation, and we'll make that available to the public afterwards for those who missed today's proceedings. I also want to take a moment to recognize the heaviness that could be and is in the air. Obviously, as Canada, we are in a collective moment of grief and grieving regarding the mass murder that's just taken place in Tumbler Ridge, British Columbia. And I know that there is going to be more to be said about that. But I didn't want this moment to slip by without us recognizing that we're here in this collective space and that we're all coming to this conversation in many different ways, and that in front of us is more grief. I also want to recognize that the topic that we are going to be discussing is one that is heavy and one that's deeply personal. And this is just one of the many distressing topics that Canadians are grappling with. But for many in this virtual space tonight, intimate partner violence is and can be a triggering topic. If you need to step away at any given time, please do. You know your needs better than we do, and we would understand if you need to log off or step away for a minute or two, or for the night. If you need extra support, please do recognize that there are resources available to you, such as the Assaulted Women's Helpline for those who are survivors who are feeling the extra need for a shoulder and a voice to lean on. There's also the Distress Centers of Greater Toronto. These resources are going to be placed in the message board / chat room, so you will know how to reach them. Those numbers are there for you, not even just tonight only, but whenever you need them. Obviously, these organizations do important work, and I would just add that they could use more government funding. So let's begin, and let's talk about intimate partner violence in Ontario, which we understand and know is a growing concern. And we do recognize that it requires a whole of government response. We are lucky, very fortunate tonight to be joined with 6 leading advocates who will share their knowledge and passions with us. We look forward to hearing from them. We are also going to turn over the floor to you later on in the evening for a dynamic and quick interactive question and answer period. There is a Q&A function on your screen, and you can think about the questions that pop up in your head as you're listening to our panelists. Feel free to type in the question, and if you would like, who do you want to direct that question to? All of this information is being sort of monitored, and we will come back at the end of this evening to talk about the questions and direct them to the right person to answer. Throughout this evening, we're also going to be using a platform called Mentimeter. This is going to create an interactive and dynamic polling that's going to take place in real time. We had over 450 people registered for this webinar. We couldn't possibly get all your answers and questions in tonight, but we want to be able to put some questions out to you. So you'll be able to see a QR screen at some point when it's times to log into Mentimeter, and you'll be asked to punch in a code, and you'll be able to participate in this discussion, and all those answers will populate on the screen in real time. So I will come back to remind you about how Mentimeter works, or menti.com, but just recognize that you are not to be sleeping at the wheel. You're supposed to be joining us in this conversation, and we're going to be making this work come alive together. So I need to sort of set the historical context. It's so important that we have a conversation that is going to be forward-thinking and future-directed on how we address intimate partner violence in this province, the most populous province in Ontario. Obviously, Alexa and I are part of the Ontario NDP caucus. This is an issue that we care deeply about, and most of you will probably recognize that Ontario has undertaken a study around IPV and have released a report. But before Ontario's most recent study on IPV, let me just turn back the clock a little bit. We have had many studies, many inquests, many coroner's reviews, and I'm just going to highlight a few of them just to show you that this work that we're doing is not new, and that many survivors have come forward to provide their testimonies, and experts and leading advocates have provided their best advice to government already. There is the triple femicide in Renfrew in 2019, the murder of Anastasia Cusick, Nathalie Warmerdin, and Carol Cullington. It resulted in a subsequent inquest in 2022 with over 86 recommendations, 68 of them directed at the provincial government. We also had the National Inquiry into Missing and Murder in Indigenous Women and Girls that was first published in 2019, and that report garnered 231 calls for justice. There's the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission, an incident that took place in the year 2000. A report was published just about 3 years afterwards with 130 recommendations. We have had plenty of recommendations, plenty of reports. What we're looking for, and I know you will agree to this, is we want to see action. I'm going to just share a little bit of the timeline of the work that the NDP has done. I've only been in political office here at Queen's Park for just under 3.5 years, but during that period of time, the Ontario NDP has called on the provincial government to declare intimate partner violence an epidemic no less than 5 times between 2024 to 2025. This calls upon and follows the recommendations of 106 municipalities. And so that's a quarter of the provinces, more than a quarter of the provinces, municipalities who've all wanted to see IPV declared it as an epidemic. The government has not done so. Instead, they declared intimate partner violence an endemic. And the difference, of course, is that the epidemic is to compel crisis level responses, just like we saw during the COVID pandemic. An endemic will acknowledge that it is, inherent and structural, but it's an ongoing issue to be managed as opposed to an endemic to try to end. So why I'm telling you this is because to set the stage for tonight's conversation. In 2025, November, just the end of last year, the government shared an IPV report that was underway, the draft report in a subcommittee. Both Alexa and I were a part of this subcommittee. We were there to write the report. We couldn't stay in the committee because there were no, the government was refusing changes. And instead, the government have a report that was written by one person, and it was extremely partisan. I'm not going to say too much about that, but I did need to say that at least so you understand that there is work that has been done in Ontario, but unfortunately, we didn't agree with how it was proceeding. And it took a lot of consideration and restraint for us because we really wanted to stay and try to make the changes necessary within the system. But that wasn't going to be the result. So we walked out of the committee, to be quite honest. It was a very hard decision, but we had to do it. And then in December, really 3 weeks later, the government then released their intimate partner violence study report. It was 877 pages. I hope you all have a chance to read it. It didn't have an executive summary. It was a little bit difficult to read. It's very big. But more importantly than that, there was no timeline and there was no community accountability circle that allows the community and leading advocates to follow the work to a determined outcome. And so the Ontario NDP then produced our own dissenting report. And our report, if you had a chance to read it, is a little bit shorter. But we also produced over 100 recommendations that echoed exactly what survivors told us, what advocates told us in over 100 deputations that came before our committee. So now, what we have before the House today, that's current legislation, is what is known as Bill 55. And Bill 55 is the latest rendition where we are asking on the provincial government to declare intimate partner violence an epidemic, but also to implement the Renfrew County inquest. And that's 86 calls, 86 recommendations. And this is on top of other legislation that is very much survivor-centered, centered towards ending sexual violence and addressing gender-based violence, as well as intimate partner violence. And this includes Lydia's Law, Safe Night Out Act, Consent Awareness Week Act, Stopping the Misuse of NDAs, and more. So all that to be said, we are not stopping. And tonight's conversation is going to roll right into all of that work. So Alexa, please come back and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristyn, for bringing us up to this moment. And thank you in advance to our speakers. I know everyone on this call is going to agree with me that it's so important to have folks that are at the front of this who are the experts, and we couldn't have gotten more fortunate than the 6 speakers that we have tonight. So we're going to introduce 3 speakers. They're going to each speak for a little bit. Then we'll have some talk back time with our Mentimeter, and then I'll introduce the other 3 speakers. So our first 3 speakers, we're going to start with Pamela Hart. Pamela is a member of the Chippewa of Georgina Island on Lake Simcoe. She has years of working in the community, offering support and advocacy to those facing intergenerational traumas, mental health, addictions, homelessness, violence, and more, so much more. And as the executive director of Native Women's Resources Center of Toronto, she continues to empower the community through restoration of identity, safe spaces, and cultural reconnection. Our second speaker after Pamela is Ololade Ajay. Ololade is a 17-year-old Black Nigerian immigrant, a student trustee for Durham Catholic District School Board. She's also vice president of operations for the Ontario Student Trustee Association. Ololade's work is driven by this strong desire to challenge systemic inequalities and create space where everyone feels welcome, safe, seen, and valued. And our third speaker in this first set is Pamela Cross. Pamela Cross is a feminist lawyer, very well known to many of us, respected expert on violence against women and the law. And she works as a researcher, a writer, an educator, a trainer with women's equality and violence against women organizations all across Canada. Pamela is also the author of the acclaimed book, And Sometimes They Kill You, Confronting the Epidemic of Intimate Partner Violence. So I invite you to take a deep breath in, settle yourself as we listen first to Pamela Hart.
Miigwech. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Pamela Hart, Wasay she who lights the way, or the light that is endless through time, Muskrat Clan from Georgina Island, and I'm very honored to be here tonight. IPV to me is MMIWG. First Nations, Inuit, Métis women are 3 times more likely to experience violence and are at greater risk of death. We make up 50% of trafficking victims and are 8 times more likely to be killed. Over 4,000 missing and murdered women and counting. The issue is bigger than partners and relationships. Indigenous women face abuse in all systems, allowing trauma and violence to continue. This is a direct response from first contact, from attempts to erase our culture, kill the Indian in the child, diminish, devalue, and over-sexualize our women. These systems were designed to eliminate us, and they still exist today. They have just taken new form, but they circle around us day in and day out. So unless these systems are redeployed, redesigned, and we address the inequities of overt racism and violence against our women and the disregard for our humanity, our humble agencies are left to face the harsh situations, case by case, person by person. Canada's narrative is that we are less than. We fight for our existence and we declare solutions, and the responses are not fierce, not fast, or fearless enough. Everything is bogged down in studies and reports that go ignored. The calls to justice go unanswered, the disconnect grows, and the consulting demands rise. And at our doorsteps of Native Women's Resource Center, we see the failures, we see the pain, we see the loss, and we see the violence firsthand. And so we activate with advocacy, housing efforts, emergency trauma responses, and most importantly, cultural supports. We offer wraparound services to show each woman and child that they are loved. We rely heavy on our friends and partners, but we also need the systems and governments to step up. We require folks to walk beside us, behind us, and not in front of us, not telling us how to respond and what the response should look like. The community knows what is needed. Decision makers around the world need to hear what we are saying. IPV, MMIWG is rooted from first contact, from racism, and we experience the violence differently as a result. IPV, MMIWG, trafficking, exploitation, undiagnosed head traumas, CAS traumas, intergenerational traumas, homelessness, but also resilience, strength, beauty, growth, sacred power. We are not siloed people. Neither is our existence. The response cannot be siloed. And so to do so is a bureaucratic effort and construct that will never have positive impacts on the community on the ground level. This action calls for heart and spirit and community direction and leadership. The world right now is in pain. The vulnerable and the unprotected are becoming more and more unseen. We need more transparent action. We have the community voices. We need them to lead the conversation and be at the table before the table is even formed, before the decision to do a study is even decided upon. We need to design the tables and its purpose. We need Indigenous-led and owned healing lodges, housing, recovery centers, enrichment programming. We need the set-aside funding created by community, and we need the truth to be known and spoken frequently. Consistency is key, and networks and conversations like this can start to break down the barriers and carve out a path that can light the way for years to come. Miigwech for having me.
And thank you, Miigwech. I'm going to invite Ololade to come up and speak.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. But before I begin, I just want to start by acknowledging the advocates, survivors, educators, and the community leaders who have been doing this work for years, often long before it received this attention. The conversations that we're having here today is built on the efforts of people who pushed systems to do better and made space for voices like mine to be here. My name is Ololade. I'm a student trustee with the Durham Catholic District School Board. I'm a student policy researcher. I'm also the vice president of operations for OSTA ACA, which represents student trustees all across Ontario. Most of the work that I do focuses on how policies affect students in real life, in classrooms, in hallways, friend groups, and in a lot of online spaces. When we talk about intimate partner violence or IPV, we mean harm that's caused by a current or former partner. That can include physical violence, emotional abuse, controlling behavior, harassment, coercion, or even cyber-enabled abuse. IPV is one form of gender-based violence that affects people of all ages, genders, and backgrounds. As we all know this year, Ontario recently released another major study on IPV. And honestly, at this point, it shows that it's not that we don't have research, it's that there's still big gaps between what we know and what's actually happening, especially for young people. So, what don't we know? Well, we know that Ontario is seeing an IPV rise. In 2024, the Ontario Provincial Police reported about 6,288 victims of intimate partner violence, which was an 18% increase from the year before, and over 75% of those victims were women. And nationally, police data shows that nearly 8 in 10 victims of IPV were women and girls in 2024. But what these numbers can't fully tell us is how early unhealthy relationship partners start for youth, how normalized certain behaviors feel, and why so many young people don't feel ready or safe to speak up. Self-reported data tells us something even more alarming. Almost 3 in 10 women aged 15 to 24 who've been in a relationship experienced some form of IPV in the past year, way higher than the older groups. So, what still needs to be done? We need consistent, real prevention. Right now, education about consent and healthy relationships depends on the school. It varies by the board, the teacher, or whether a single lesson can even be offered. Some students graduate with strong knowledge, others don't. That inconsistency leaves too many students without the language or tools to recognize unhealthy patterns early. We also need to think about what happens after a student reaches out for help. Most IPV never gets reported at all, even outside of Ontario, because fear, stigma, or uncertainty keeps people silent. So, if reporting feels confusing or overwhelming, a lot of students just stay silent. Why hasn't this been fully addressed yet? Honestly, because prevention is long-term work. It's less visible than emergency responses, and it requires challenging deeply rooted norms about power, gender, and relationships. It also requires including youth voices, not just in conversation, but in the policy design and implementation, not just as an afterthought. We need to invest in early, consistent education, make sure that every school has clear and trauma-informed support pathways, and include young people as active partners in shaping solutions, not just the audience for them. When students help design messaging and systems, these tools are way more likely to work. Ending IPV and gender-based violence isn't just about reacting after harm happens. It's about changing the culture for young people, how we grow up in it. So respect, boundaries, and healthy relationships are the norm, not the exception. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. Deep appreciation for you. You can see all the love coming across the screen there. And Pamela, I'd like to turn our attentions to you, Pamela Cross.
Thank you. Thank you to Kristyn and Alexa, both of you, for creating the opportunity for so many of us to come together to have this important conversation. It's really exciting to see so many people here. And I'm glad that this will be recorded so that folks who couldn't join us tonight can be part of a different conversation at another time. I want to touch on 3 things, all of which are rooted in 2 important events that took place in 2022. The CKW inquest in Renfrew County, and the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission hearings. I could easily talk about each one of them for an hour, but I have 4 minutes altogether. So think of this as a quick peek and a way to stimulate this and future discussions. First, Kristyn, when you introduced the evening, you talked about the need for an all-of-government response. And I want to encourage us to think even more broadly than that, because the truth is that we're only going to eradicate gender-based violence with an all-of-society response. Public awareness is a critical component of any strategy to end gender-based violence. We're not going to do it, no matter how good we are at what we do, if the public does not have a deep understanding of GBV and what social, economic, and legal frameworks are needed to eradicate it. The media are important allies in raising that awareness, and never before in the time that I've been doing this work has there been as much interest by both mainstream and social media as there is now. We need to take advantage of that interest, maintain existing and build new relationships with key journalists, and take the time to enhance our own media skills. Second, I spend a lot of my time on the road speaking about gender-based violence issues across Ontario, and I learn a lot from this. Since the summer of 2022, I've seen a dramatic increase in the interest by members of the public in ensuring that communities are safe for everyone. Those of us who do this work have many long-standing working relationships beyond our movement. And now is the time to make those collaborations even broader and deeper. I'm just going to give one example. I could give lots, but I'm going to give one. The National Farmers Union, at its annual convention a couple of months ago, passed a resolution confirming that IPV is an epidemic, noting the unique challenges for rural women, in particular women farmers, and committing to being part of the work to work with all of us to end gender-based violence. We need to build on these relationships. We need to reach out to other organizations in our communities, even ones we may never have considered to be allies. I really, really believe that we can work across many differences as long as we share some core values and goals. The third thing I want to say is this: meaningful, independent government accountability and oversight is critical in our work to eradicate gender-based violence. We don't need more reports. We don't need more inquest recommendations. We don't even need recommendations from the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, and I probably shouldn't say that because I'm a member. We know what we need to know. Now what we need is for governments to be accountable to us in doing what needs to be done. CKW recommendations, Mass Casualty Commission recommendations call for this, and I think they may be the most important of everything those bodies have recommended. Of course, this kind of accountability is also the hardest change to implement, and that's why I think it has to sit at the heart of all of our activism and advocacy. We could start by reinstating Ontario's Violence Against Women Roundtable. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much to our first three speakers. You have certainly set the table for a dynamic conversation moving ahead. You have given us some very compelling reasons why we can't sit on our hands, but also you've given us some examples, concrete examples, which I have to admit, as someone who sat on the IPV committee at Queen's Park, and in particular, Pamela Hart, you provided a number of recommendations that was not heard. And that might be because our committee wasn't allowed to travel. We weren't allowed to leave Toronto. So we heard from people who were coming to Toronto, but we didn't get to hear everyone. Thank you, Pamela Cross, Pamela Hart, and Ololade Ajay for your very powerful testimonies. Now we're going to turn over to you, the audience members. As I made a commitment to, we're going to put the Menti sort of QR code onto the screen. You're going to be able to take your phone out. This is the 21st century, so get it to your camera setting. Please scan that QR code as I'm doing right now. Click on menti.com as you see, and you'll get a chance to punch in the code. And the code is 89890021. 89890021. And it's going to bring us to a new screen on your phone. You'll get to see the question reflected on the screen as well. So I've got 3 questions for all of you. You get to interact with us with your digital device. And I want you to answer this question for us. Did you know that there was no provincial epidemic declaration after the MMIWG inquiry that found that violence against Indigenous women constitutes a genocide? So long before everyone else started calling for an IPV declaration, we had the MMIWG. And did you know that the provincial government made no declaration that MMIWG, although found to be a genocide, is also an epidemic? So looks like there's a lot of you who are in the audience who actually are aware of this.
Yeah.
Some of you knew that the MMIWG took place, but you didn't know that there was no declaration. And some of you have said, 28 of you have said, and more growing, that this is new information. So
Mhm.
yeah. Alexa, you have a reflection?
I'm wildly impressed with how many people do know this, and maybe it speaks a little bit to what Pamela Cross was saying about there's just a growing sense of understanding about this everywhere. I'm hopeful that this means that that the work that so many have done, even long before you and I got on the scene and others, is really starting to lead to an awareness, and I hope that that this conversation tonight continues to grow that movement. So I know we've got are we moving to the next slide now?
Yes, we are. Thank you very much for that. So the next question is a little bit shorter, but the question really relates to sexual violence in schools. What do you think ends sexual violence and intimate partner violence in schools? And you can choose a number of responses. You don't have to choose one, but adequately funding schools, community organizations and having more educators, police and resource officers. What do you think would actually address IPV in schools? And remember, you can choose more than one.
Mm-hmm. Kristyn, it's great to see how many people are plugging in. I think in our first question, it was just a bit of a warm up. We've got, many more answers on this one here. So it's great with
Yeah.
many people seeing community organizations and educators and adequate funding in schools as the key.
Yeah. And I would say from our experience listening to teachers and educators, school board trustees, school boards, they have told us that if you fund the schools adequately, smaller classrooms, more caring adults, more mental health support workers, more social workers, you're going to see violence in the communities and schools come down, but also bringing probably comprehensive sexual education in early. So people can talk about healthy relationship and consent. That's going to help. So overwhelmingly, you folks have decided that, the tools to end sexual violence and IPV in schools is by adequately funding schools and making sure that there's community organizations that are plugged in, as well as more educators. A few of you think that it's police officers in schools, and just a few of you are just not sure. This gives us a really clear indication of what you know to be the answers to addressing this question. So we're going to move on to our next question. Thanks everyone for participating. We've got one more question before we go back to speakers. And this one is going to be really one that asks you to give us your thoughts about Ontario's family court. Do you believe Ontario's family court system adequately protects survivors of intimate partner violence and their children? Is the court system working for survivors right now? We know that you can report, but oftentimes getting through the court system and getting where you need to go, people have a different response. So the answers that you get to choose from are, yes, the system works well. Second option is it offers some protection, but has major gaps. No, absolutely not. The system regularly fails survivors. And another option is, I don't know enough about family court to say.
So, Kristyn,
Okay.
we're seeing a lot of people coalescing around the one answer that the system regularly fails survivors. And I know we've seen this quite a bit with the way that survivors are treated, the way that the courts are so backlogged and take so much time, the lack of resources and supports for survivors going through the system.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me as the answers pop onto the screen is that not a single one of you in the audience says that the justice system is working well for survivors.
Mhm.
Now, you don't need to plug an answer in if you feel that that category is feeling lonely. This is a very honest reflection of what
Mhm.
survivors and advocates see to be the shortcomings of a justice system. So why do we call it a justice system if justice is actually not being delivered in a timely fashion? And that is definitely a reoccurring theme that we have heard throughout my time at Queen's Park. But
Mhm.
wow, we have over 205 people on this call right now, and not a single one of you thinks that the system is working well. That's a very powerful answer. Thank you very much, folks. Um, so I'm going to bring Alexa back onto the screen. We've got our next three speakers, and she's going to set the stage and tell us who they are.
Thanks, Kristyn, for leading us through that section. And just before I introduce these three final advocates with their bios, a reminder to be thinking about your questions and putting them into the Q&A so that we can be going through them, and we'll be curating some of them. If there's two or three that overlap and are sort of the same, we'll try to bundle them up so as many of you as possible hear some part of your answers. So just to be thinking about your questions. Our next speaker is Erin Lee. Erin Lee has been the executive director of Lanark County Interval House and Community Sports since 2007. And Erin is widely recognized for her work in the anti-violence activism, intimate partner violence awareness, prevention awareness, education, leadership, and particularly for women and children living in rural and small towns. So we're really glad to have you here, Erin. Andrea Vasquez-Jimenez is an Afro-Latina community organizer born in Colombia to immigrant parents in Toronto. She's founder of and director and principal consultant of Policing Free Schools, where she works with communities to organize for the uprooting of policing and carceral infrastructures, practices, policies, culture, and logistics in educational spaces, and is looking to replace them with transformative, equitable, healing-centered, policing-free educational spaces. So we're really glad to have you here, Andrea. And our third and final speaker in this second section is Marlee Liss. Marlee Liss is an award-winning speaker, a survivor advocate, somatic educator, author, and sparkle-loving lesbian based in Toronto. Her sexual assault case set precedents in North America after concluding with restorative justice through the courts. Marlee is the author of Re-Humanize, the founder of Survivors for Justice Reform, and has supported thousands in reimagining justice and healing trauma. So I'd like to turn the floor and the space over to the three speakers, starting with Erin.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to amplify rural voices at this town hall. I'm honored to be with such a well-decorated panel and seeing so many faces that need to be leading this work in our community. I want to start by saying that Ontario is actually more rural than it is urban. So whenever we're thinking about what we're going to consider and what we're going to do and what the action's going to look like, we must consider rural and remote and northern communities in any action on intimate partner violence. In fact, I'm not here to make friends. I want to say that Factually speaking, in 2023, the rate of police reported intimate partner violence against women in rural Ontario was over 50% higher than in urban areas. I think it is important for us to recognize that these are the realities that the highest percentage of our population is living through. When the 2022 Renfrew inquest happened and the recommendations were made, 106 municipalities in Ontario declared the intimate partner violence an epidemic. The primary message was that this was a recommendation that came from the jury. It came from the people. It didn't come from advocates and people giving testimony. It came from the jury. And the primary message was that this declaration had to be backed. It had to be backed immediately with long-term provincial funding and a whole of government response. We weren't looking for symbolic recognition. We were looking for an all of government response, much like our Indigenous sisters have for centuries at this point. It is important for us to push where we can push and look to the leadership who's willing to back the need to push. For those of you on the call who maybe don't see the intricacies or the nuances of rural and remote communities, it's really important to talk about the lack of privacy. In rural and remote and northern communities, the everyone knows everyone factor is a reality. So when you're trying to flee and you need to cross the bridge, and at the other end of the bridge is a police cruiser, and you can't leave your community safely as a result of that, that is a rural reality. Being isolated and having a lack of transportation, it's a huge barrier in rural communities. But not only is it a huge barrier in communities, it's important to talk about the isolation and lack of transportation from the perspective of you taking out your vehicle and your kilometers being tracked and your gas levels in the vehicle being tracked. Those are rural realities that we don't talk about. Thinking about economic dependency on land and livestock, when we talk about women often face unique financial pressures and realities that are tied to a family farm, and leaving might mean abandoning their home, but also their livelihood and the animals, which are sometimes actually used as tools of coercion by the abuser. High lethality and risk due to firearms and geography. Firearm proliferation is huge in rural communities. As was demonstrated in the Renfrew County inquest, they are used 30%, they're more likely to be threatened by a rifle in a rural community than you are in an urban community. Those are important realities. The notion of calling 911 and having a police response come in 3.2 minutes is not something you experience in a rural, remote, or a northern community. You know, you're talking about how many patrol cars are on duty, what location they are in the particular geographical area. So 42 minutes after the call has been made, the woman is now hiding in a ditch on the side of the road for her life and has rolled down that ditch hoping that the abuser who is looking for her doesn't find her before the police arrive. Those are some of the realities that I want to make sure people are hearing in Ontario about rural communities. So what? So what do we need now in terms of action? We need to recognize that funding formulas do not work for rural, remote, northern communities. The current funding formula the government is using, it doesn't work. It doesn't take in the context, it doesn't take in the unique relationships and the unique landscape of those particular communities. We need to be trusted that we know what we're doing, and we need to have self-directed funding that is based on the local context. Patchwork funding, where we are relying on under-resourced and unpredictable grant applications, where we're competing with each other, and there's no sustained money, and the capacity, it's all capacity-based funding. That doesn't work to speak to the value that Ontario needs to message to women and children and gender diverse folks who are enduring every day in communities. Community-led solutions We need to be engaged in the solutions that the government is formulating. We need to be informing that. We need to see survivors at the table. We need to make sure that there is room and space held for permanent consultation with community-led solutions, whether that's virtual legal clinics like Luke's Place does, whether that's outreach services or perseverance pantries that exist in very rural communities to try and get food and nourishment to families. We need to continue to think about intersectionality. It's not just a term of the day, it's a reality for so many communities, Indigenous women, newcomers to LGBTQIA communities, and individuals in rural communities face even greater compounded barriers to safety and support. So big issues related to funding, public education, and community engagement. If you look back at recommendations that MPP Wong-Tam referenced at the beginning, every single inquest and all kinds of recommendations from the DVDRC talk about public education and community engagement. There is no permanent funding allocated to shelter organizations, anti-violence agencies, Indigenous agencies related to public education and community engagement. We can't get upstream if we don't have the paddle to get up there. We can't make those kinds of permanent changes without the recognition that we need to inform and educate our community, but we need to be in a position to do so. When we say everybody has a role, we believe everybody has a role. Rural, remote, northern areas rely on informal support, volunteers, neighbors, aunties, and others in our communities. Everybody does have a role and needs to be valued. We talk about changing social norms. There's a need to challenge the traditional patriarchy and the views that define IPV as this family matter that nobody wants to talk about. And in rural communities, that still exists, and we need to move that way. I want to commend all of my colleagues and my sisters on the screen, and I support your recommendations thus far, and I will continue to do so. And I especially want to support Pamela Cross, your recommendation related to the oversight and advisory roundtable. We need a call for a commissioner. We need to reinstate the capacity that is nonpartisan. Intimate partner violence doesn't pick a party. It's intimate partner violence happens everywhere. We need to keep it there. We need to keep it front and center. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I'd like to now pass the mic over to Andrea to share her wisdom and her thoughts.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. It's important that we recognize the issue of police in schools, the advocacy and organizing for policing-free schools as a gender-based violence issue, including intimate partner violence. I'll be using my time to briefly highlight research as it relates to police committing gender-based violence and how the recommendation of police in schools found within the Intimate Partner Violence Report does not solve what the government purports it to be a solution for. And lastly, I'll be ending off with what can be immediately done if there were to be political will. Danielle McNabb, an assistant professor who researches Canadian public law at Ontario-based Brock University, has previously spoken to the reality that within the literature on gender-based violence, that police are disproportionately perpetrators. And right here in Ontario, CBC News reported on data pertaining to 2013 to 2024 that 1 in 3 police with paid suspensions involved gender-based violence. Despite this reality, the Ford government's report authored by MPP Dixon doesn't touch on this crisis, which would have been within their scope of the committee's mandate. Instead, positions police in schools as a key point of supposed prevention, particularly school-based policing programs, as a normalized fundamental feature under the guise of a recommendation of policing in schools, being what they define as a supposed structural component of Ontario's student safety infrastructure and as part of Ontario's broader violence prevention strategy. We already know the impact of policing in schools as well in regards to school-related gender-based violence, whether it be under the name of school resource officers or otherwise. Students, including survivors, lived experiences are clear, just as the research is in regards to the systemic issue of policing in schools. And that is that policing does not make educational spaces safer. Policing does not prevent or reduce manufactured violence in educational spaces. Policing has harmful impacts on students. Some of those harmful impacts, including regarding gender-based violence, are those found within community-based research, including right here in Ontario. For instance, by our Ottawa-based partner, Isilu Collective's report titled, Ottawa Students Speak Out, Cops Out of Our Schools. It was reported that school resource officers reinforce a culture of gender-based violence, including sexual violence, where victims and survivors were shamed, intimidated into silence, and even threatened with being criminalized themselves. A perpetuation of rape culture was present, officers actively undermining and dismissing survivors' experiences, including that of youth dating violence, intimate partner violence, and accusing them even of lying. Counts of acts of sexual and gendered harassment from SROs themselves against gender-oppressed students, along with SRO-led efforts to supposedly tackle sexual violence focused on victim-blaming rhetoric. And meanwhile, the government acknowledges U.S. data and research within the report. It does not do so when it comes to the issue of police in schools. For instance, updated data from our U.S.-based partners, the Advancement Project, and the Alliance for Educational Justice, #AssaultAt report on police violence on students, from 2011 to 2023 shows gender-based violence, including that the third most frequent type of assault of students by police stationed in and around schools was sexual assault. Ultimately, we share the same vision and goal, including for our schools to be truly healthy, safe, and thriving. And that includes being free from gender-based violence. And the reality is police presence in schools, a non-evidence-based, harmful, and fiscally irresponsible recommendation of police in schools will not get us there. On the other hand, properly funded, supported, and resourced schools and communities alongside addressing root issues will. And I finish off with saying that we know that schools are part of our communities, and what is evidence-based is a holistic-based approach. However, meanwhile, millions of dollars are being plummeted into policing in schools, actions that replicate and exacerbate harm. It is being siphoned out of what would actually address root issues, both at the schooling, community, personal, interpersonal, systemic, and structural level. That concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Deep appreciation for the work that you're doing and, of course, the fight that you are working within Coalition on Bill 33, which is a whole other piece. So grateful for your words today. Our final speaker is Marlee Liss. Marlee, would you like to unmute and join us?
Yeah, thank you so much to all of my panelists tonight, all the panelists for all of your work. Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here and prioritizing these conversations. Well, I'm glad that the recent Ontario IPV report mentioned restorative justice. I urge us to go so much deeper. If we're truly committed to justice and safety, we need to take restorative justice options seriously and center the voices of survivors who have been long advocating for this. We know that gender-based violence is drastically underreported for good reason. We know the rates of acquittal are high, and we need to be honest that majority of the time, the criminal legal system fails to produce justice and accountability. Currently, less than 1% of sexual assault cases in Canada end with any legal sanctions. And restorative justice can play a major role in filling that gap. And that is exactly what it did for me. I experienced sexual assault. I was raped for several hours. And afterward, I did what survivors are told we're supposed to do. I reported, I cooperated, I testified, but instead of feeling vindicated, I only experienced re-traumatization, invasive questioning, and a years-long process that ultimately only piled harm on top of harm. I came to understand on a cellular level why so many describe the court process as a second rape. After years of being let down by that system, I decided to do my own research, which no survivor should have to do, and eventually learned about restorative justice. I'm grateful every single day to the Indigenous communities who have paved these practices and to the one Crown attorney, Kara Sweeney, who really listened to what I needed and fought for that outcome. I ended up experiencing restorative justice in that my assailant underwent several months of extensive therapy, and we eventually met in a facilitated circle. In comparison to the court process, it was trauma-informed, survivor-centered, humane, and actually healing. I was able to voice the impact, ask the questions I'd held for years, and my assailant finally took meaningful accountability. And for the first time since before the assault, I felt seen and like my voice actually mattered. And despite what many people think, restorative justice did not minimize the violence. It actually addressed it directly. And it did everything possible to ensure that this harm does not happen again. Everyone walked away from that process a more healed, more resourced, and therefore more safe member of society. Since sharing my story publicly, I've heard from thousands of survivors, and I continue to hear from survivors every day. And again, I hear how the criminal legal system is failing us. But the statement that really fuels my advocacy is that what I hear the most is, I wish I knew about restorative justice. I hear this from survivors whose cases ended with stays or acquittals. I hear this from survivors whose families were torn apart by the courtroom. I hear this from queer, trans, Black, Indigenous survivors who were not taken seriously or who were not safe with law enforcement. These survivors wanted accountability and safety, but were only given one narrow path. In response, I founded Survivors for Justice Reform, a coalition that in just 1 year brought together over 800 survivors calling for more access to restorative justice. We want to see restorative justice programs being well funded, and we want to see Crown Policy D4 amended so that survivors who want this option have access to it. We're not asking for less accountability or trying to close the door to the criminal legal system. Instead, we're asking for another door to be opened. Often this work can feel heavy, but this is a call to action that's actually rooted in hope. It can be crushing to acknowledge the prevalence of gender-based violence, but restorative justice can offer a path forward, and one that is actually shown to be more compatible with accountability, safety, and healing. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you to our three additional speakers. What remarkably charged uh, testimonies, not testimonies, but presentations you gave. This has been a very moving evening so far. I gotta tell you, there's a lot I expected. You're exceeding every single expectation. And thank you for staying on time. I know we gave you the impossible task of saying, bring us your best 4 minutes, and I just want to say thank you. Just because the conversation is so important, but we also want to make sure we get the audience interaction. And folks, I want to encourage everyone to continue to plug your questions into the chat. These folks have spent decades, cumulatively, all of them, addressing intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. And I'm sure that many of them will want to hear questions from you. So keep plugging them in. And I see that good ones are already coming through. So we're going to turn the screen over once again to Mentimeter. Menti is going to bring us our next question onto the screen. And you've already started to answer them. That's fantastic. So here is our next question. We got a series of 5 coming to you, but on your screen, you're going to be given some options. Were you aware that rural shelters in Ontario are running at currently at 125% capacity? What that means is that if you're looking for a bed in a shelter, you are not going to find one. So let us know. Yes, you are aware. I knew shelters were strained, but not to that number. And no, this is new information to us. And a very big shout out and thank you to Erin Lee for putting a very fine point and exclamation mark on the fact that rural experiences around gender-based violence and IPV are different, and they need to have a different response, proportional response to that difference. So it looks like there's quite a bit of awareness that this is a problem. And perhaps some of you are aware of that number, but you didn't think it was that high. So I guess in Ontario, if you are someone who's looking for a shelter bed, in rural Ontario, you're certainly not going to find it. I know the challenge is just as stark in Toronto, but I don't think it's as high as 125 capacity. Thanks for answering that question, folks. We're going to move on to our next question. And the next question is, do you think survivors of sexual assault and intimate partner violence should have access to the restorative justice options if they choose it? So feel free to answer that question. Yes, survivors should have that choice. Another option is I'm open to it, but I have some concerns. Another possible answer is no, I believe the criminal justice should exclusively handle these cases. And a final option is I need to learn more about restorative justice before I can say yes or no. Okay. So a lot of you folks are saying that survivors should have that choice. They should determine for themselves what justice looks like. Not surprisingly, considering there's not a single one of you in the audience that thought the justice system was working fine for survivors. And thank you very much, everyone, for answering these questions so quickly. We are going to move on to another slide. So here's another question, and this is a question directed around, what's happening in our schools. And we heard from Ololade that there's quite a bit. So do you think the Ontario's Ministry of Education is doing enough to educate young people about healthy relationships and intimate partner violence? Like literally, we're getting down to the brass discussion around consent and how do we develop those relationships into healthy, nurturing relationships from teen dating to, more mature relationships. What does it look like? So you can answer, yes, the curriculum is sufficient. Things are working fine. You can also select a response that says some efforts exist, but there are major gaps. Some of you are saying, a lot of you are saying, I should say, no, the Ministry of Education is not adequately addressing this. And then another option is I don't have enough visibility into what schools are doing. And that's fair. And now that the school board trustees and some of the trustees are gone, it's going to be even harder to take a look behind the curtain. But really, the majority of you are saying that the Ministry of Education is not adequately doing enough to address this concern. That is regrettably not surprising. Just as the previous answer, it was not surprising that that survivors are looking for alternative routes of justice when you see that the current justice system isn't working. So we're going to move on to another slide. And thanks everyone for participating. This one is going to allow you, the next question and slide is going to invite you to pick one word. And you can answer this question with a word that describes how you want the Ontario government to respond to the issue of IPV and GBV. And we're going to see a little word cloud populate. So what you're seeing on your screen is basically your questions populating, and what are some of the words that are really, really resonating? You folks are looking for action. You're looking for the government to be proactive. You're looking for accountability. You're also asking for trauma-informed resolutions. I can see that there's a lot of attention on prevention, which we know IPV is preventable. It's pervasive, but we also have heard from survivor after survivor and leading advocate after leading advocate is that this is preventable stuff. And a number of you are calling for it to be declared an epidemic. So yeah, there's a lot of action on the screen right now, and that's because many of you are still typing. But you can see the big themes coming up is trauma-informed solutions for survivors, action stays at the center of this. You guys are all looking for action and accountability. That's got to be centering everything that this government does. And I like to borrow from what Pam has said at the beginning, is that we need a whole of government, whole of society approach. It's not just going to be one resolution. So that's fantastic. I know you guys are still typing in, but that is a pretty powerful word cloud if I've seen one. And there's a lot of unique answers. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm really impressed with what I'm seeing on the screen. Okay, we're going to move on. Even though you may still be tinkering around on that, just because we want to definitely get to the Q&A portion of tonight. So for those who have had a chance to read the Ontario NDP's dissenting report, such a weird thing, we call it a dissenting report, but it's really because it's an official record of our position to the government's IPV report, which of course is, we know has a lot of AI credit writing, but here we go. The NDP's dissenting report included 121 recommendations to end IPV in Ontario. Which do you believe is the single most important urgent action? So declare IPV an epidemic in Ontario, invest in affordable and transitional housing for survivors, increase core funding for shelters and victim services, expand legal aid eligibility for survivors, fund school-based prevention and consent education, provide OHIP funding, funded mental health services for survivors. And as you're choosing the answers to this question, what I want to share with you is that these pillars or these actions that you're seeing on the screen came directly from the testimony. Over 100 testimonials were provided, and we pulled out of the recommendations the core ones that kept coming up, and some of them were just reoccurring. Every single day of the testimony, we heard people say, please just declare it as an epidemic, but don't stop there, take the action. We heard about the underfunding of shelters and basic services for survivors. Every nonprofit out there is stretching a dime into a dollar, and the government funding has been plateaued. And when there has been an increase, it's been modest. And then that one-time modest increase didn't meet up and match up with the rate of inflation. So what we have on the screen right now is the majority of you, and not exclusively, but you're calling for IPV to be declared an epidemic. And I just want to remind you, because this question asks you to select one thing. Some of you might have wanted to say 2 or 3 things, but out of the people who've answered, you're saying name it as an epidemic. You're also calling on the government, the Ford government, to invest in affordable and transitional housing for survivors. Alexa, you'll probably know, we heard from so many people, advocates who said, if women had an affordable, safe place to go to, they could leave that abusive relationship. But instead, the housing in Ontario is expensive, and they were forced to stay with the abuser. And of course, many of you are calling for core funding for shelters and victim services. So basically, more money, core funding, stabilize the sector that's providing support to survivors, and stick with it. Okay. So we are now turning this over to the audience. This is a
Thanks.
section where you get to ask questions. Alexa, take us away.
Oh my goodness, Kristyn, there are really thoughtful questions here. And I'm grateful. Clearly people were engaged and paying a lot of attention. And there's a lot of heart in these. I'm going to start with one that is open to the panel, and the person who wrote the question says, particularly interested in Pamela Cross's thoughts, but open to the panel as well. It says, therapists are required to limit their practice to within their scope, and this contributes to accountable practices of psychotherapy. However, judges do not appear to be held to similar standards, as evidenced by the recent decision at the hockey trial in London, Ontario, where the judge disallowed expert testimony by those who understand trauma responses and the impact of substance use. So how can we expect justice when the courts disallow relevant information and where there is no accountability for judges to be informed? Pamela, did you want to speak to that?
Sure. I don't have a happy answer for the person who asked that question. This is certainly at the center of a lot of the problems with both family and criminal law responses. Um, like Marlee, I think we have to be looking outside the box that law has become in this country. But it exists, and women are caught in that box, and so we have to make it work as well as we can. Um, we have to have truly mandatory education for judges. The legislation that exists federally and provincially in Ontario opens the door to opportunities for judges to become educated, but it's not mandatory. I realize, this is a complicated question that we could spend the whole evening talking about, and I'm not going to make people do that. But we have to get past those complications and say, look, when a judge is newly appointed to the bench, they learn how to interpret breathalyzer evidence when it's put in front of them. They learn how to do this, they learn how to do that. They need to learn about trauma. They need to learn about the importance of expert evidence being presented. And that's in both family and criminal court. How we do that is a much bigger and more challenging question, but it has to be one of the high priorities for those of us who are supporting women who are involved with those court systems.
Thank you. Thank you, Pamela. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to speak to that. Welcome to just unmute if you do, but if you don't, that's okay. We've got a lot of questions here, so good. I have another question here about the spike in demand for emergency shelters, transitional housing. I know that this is something, Erin, you spoke about too, but also affordable rent geared to income housing. And we know Toronto is in a housing crisis, affordability crisis. So are other municipalities. And I know that the housing starts for the provincial government are down year over year. But we're also in a social and violence crisis. So what can be done to ramp up support and funding to create safe spaces for women and children fleeing violence and supports to help them get the best next step that they can? What are you seeing out there to the panelists that would be your recommendation on this?
I could get us started by saying that I think in many rural communities, what is happening is we're doing it ourselves. Second stage and transitional housing is not being funded. If you were grandfathered or grandmothered in, you still get funding, but if you are a newer second stage housing provider, you don't get funding. And so what we're doing is we're creating these creative relationships with builders, and with owners of properties, and we're trying to create a win-win situation in our community. In our community, we probably have, in our agency, we have about 18 units that are either we have set up, we have purchased, or we're working in partnership with someone else to try and find safe, affordable options for women in community, including working with landlords on making priorities for women. There are so much stigma about renting to survivors of violence in terms of what landlords believe will be bringing into their properties. And we got to break down those stigmas. And we also have to provide incentive in municipalities for landlords to be engaged as part of the solution and recognize how that will actually help to end gender-based violence and help to increase options. I know Pamela Hart had her hand up, so I'm going to stop there.
Thanks so much. This question means a lot to me, so thank you to whoever brought it forward. Native women did a lot of work during COVID to change the narrative around homelessness and shelters. And this discussion that violence against women and homelessness were two separate things, and violence was a provincial matter, and therefore the city didn't, have to respond. And so we did a lot of work at advocacy discussing that these were not separate matters, that if you were fleeing violence, you were instantly homeless. And if you were homeless, you were at great risk of violence on the streets of Toronto. There's very few in Ontario and no Indigenous emergency shelters for women in the city of Toronto. We have been working with our partners in the city quite closely, and I must applaud them for, really hearing the community and taking some brave steps to push our voices forward. And I'm pleased to share with anyone who doesn't know that Native Women's will be opening an emergency shelter in the city of Toronto for Indigenous women and their children. It will be in partnership with the city, and this is not a homeless shelter. This is not a violence against women shelter. This is a shelter and a safe place for women who need it, because there is nowhere to send them when they are fleeing violence, when they come to our doorsteps because they escaped their trafficker, when they've come into the city from, rural reserves, or they've relocated from other provinces, or they're coming into the city to start school. So many people come into the city by force or by choice, and sometimes there's just nothing we can do. And in a few years, there will be 80 beds that we can place women safely in. So, housing affordability, we all have to keep going and growing. It is us doing the work, which can be quite daunting and difficult, and development and, piecing the funding envelopes together. But like I said earlier, we are the ones on the ground doing it, and no one's going to do it for the community. And um, so just keep going, keep going. Housing is a crisis for everyone right now, everyone. And I'm just so pleased that we're going to be able to provide a couple of spaces, and some secure, safe beds for however long some women and children will need it.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for that. And Erin, one of the questions that has popped up here is in a space that we haven't yet talked about, and that is hospitals. This is someone who says, I work in a hospital, and the Ontario Hospital Association has held hospitals accountable to enact the Ryan Inquest recommendations. To Pamela's point and others, we know what's needed in healthcare: screening, safety, listening, referral. Can the panelists suggest and share other suggestions for hospital best practices? And I want to open that up in case there's also a space we haven't talked about tonight that you think there's a best practice that you want to bring into this conversation. We've talked a little bit about housing. We've talked about the justice system, and shelters and space, but hospitals and maybe other best practices and spaces.
I think that I'm sure all of us have something we could say about this. I think that the recommendations from the Ryan inquest provide a really excellent starting point for hospitals. That was a situation where an older woman was killed by her husband in the emergency room of a hospital after there had been a history of intimate partner violence, lots of red flags, and people should either did know and didn't do anything, or didn't know things they should have known. So I think that's a starting point. They're good recommendations. It's an inquest that focused on substantive recommendations rather than thousands, and so they can be read. I've talked to lots of folks who work in emergency rooms in particular, who say they're really grateful to have those recommendations, because now they can go to their supervisors and their supervisors' supervisors and say, look, this is what we have to start doing in our hospital. It certainly isn't going to address all of the problems in what is a huge institutional system, the healthcare system, but I think that might be a way through the door that's accessible to lots of people.
Thanks, Pamela. Erin?
I just wanted to draw some attention to not just the Ryan inquest, but the realities for aging and elder couples in Ontario. Ontario seeing about a 16% increase of those who are identifying as seniors. Our Ontario population is aging, and one of the things I would suggest, if people were open to that, is that the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee has just recently released a report, and there is a full chapter in that report that is specifically related to aging and elder homicides and femicides, with recommendations. And a lot of the recommendations speak to work in healthcare, in hospitals, and long-term care facilities related to when when memory challenges start to rise. And we were able to call in experts from a lot of like Elder Abuse Ontario and so on to help guide us with that report. So I'd recommend that as something to consider, because I think that the level of violence in aging communities is often silenced and overlooked because we are focused on, their mobility, their this and their that, but we're not thinking about their trauma, their past traumas, their current traumas, and what's going on. So the escalation of violence is real when people age, and I think it is a space that we should remember in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to have time for one, maybe two more questions. But I wanted to also pause just to let you know that Kristyn and I are so grateful for everyone that's on this call. We're also grateful for the work of our NDP caucus. So many who spoke out in the multiple times that we invited the government to declare intimate partner violence an epidemic, have put forward bills. And on tonight's call, we have Peggy Sattler, we have Lise Vaugeois, we have Lisa Gretzky, and I know that many others were sharing this broadly with their networks. So I just wanted to acknowledge our colleagues who do a tremendous amount of work. Thank you. There's a question here that I think might be a good one for Andrea or Marlee, and maybe some others. Feel free to raise your hand. But it says, we need culturally responsive and multi-sectoral approaches to intimate partner violence prevention. But what does meaningful community engagement look like when designing these programs, particularly for communities that have historically been harmed by the systems that are meant to protect them?
I'm going to speak briefly to this. I think there's a lot of folks who have become cynical, especially with governments who, we have ongoing consultations, ongoing even community engagement, a breadth of reports, research, recommendations. And so prior to even starting with meaningful community engagement, community needs to see that action is being taken immediately. There are more than enough recommendations that we can actionize prior to even moving towards that step, because trust needs to be rebuilt with community first and foremost.
Thank you, Andrea.
One perspective I can bring in as well is just a call for us to kind of challenge this binary we've created of response and prevention, and actually bridge those things. If we treat response as an opportunity for secondary prevention to stop harm from being caused again, I think we start doing things really differently, and we start actually asking how we can break cycles of violence rather than just transferring harm from a victim back to a perpetrator. And then also just a call to place consent at the forefront of all this work. We should be turning toward the people and communities harmed, asking them what's meaningful to them, asking what they need, and building processes around that.
Thank you so much, both of you. Kristyn, I'm going to turn it over to you for your final thoughts and to thank our speakers.
Thank you so much, Alexa. We have one more question for the audience before we get going. But before I ask that question, I just want to say once again, thank you to our very esteemed speakers for spending some time with us this evening. Clearly, there are so many questions that we could not get the time to provide the answers to, but it also tells me that there's a real hunger for this dialogue. And I think, Pamela Cross probably said it best, is that we do need this whole of society approach to addressing this issue. And by the energy that I'm seeing in this sort of virtual space, many of you are coming in from outside of Toronto and outside of GTHA and outside of Southern Ontario. If we can amplify your energy and call, this is really the next step. So the government has released this massive report that, some of you have read, some of you have not read, but really, I think at the end of the day, we need to call for accountability. And accountability by centering the voice of survivors and advocates who've been in the movement for decades calling for justice, but accountability that is going to be transparent, that is going to be supported with the resources of government so that there's an ongoing dialogue and collaboration, because I think another speaker had noted that this should not be a partisan issue. And I agree. And we really need to find a way to get everybody into the same room, even if they're invited and not attending. You know what? The invitation's got to go out, and that's where we need to be. So again, tonight, I want to remind people that Assaulted Women's helpline is available. This has been a very heavy conversation, but I think also very forward thinking. I have seen a lot of solutions being put forward by the advocates on the screen. There's also, of course, the Distress Center. We want you to think about ways to be kind to yourself. What does that look like after a discussion like this? For me, it's kind of like pouring a cup of tea. I need to turn off my devices and just sort of sit with what are the gifts, the jewels of information that are shared so I can move forward with action. I am going to just say thank you once again to Andrea, to Erin, to Pam, to Marlee, and to Ololade, who's actually in the middle of her exams. That little student trustee is off to do her studies because, well, it's not easy being a student in Ontario, God knows. But bless her for finding time to join us today. So my last question to all of you, and we're going to put this back on the screen. I hope you've enjoyed Mentimeter. It allows us to create some dynamic back and forth. But our last question is really about getting you to make a commitment. After this event, what is one thing you can do in your life to support survivors on work towards ending intimate partner violence in your local community or in Ontario? You could type in your answer. You could share with us, but this is your own commitment to doing something in your local community. And while you type in those answers, I want to say thank you to my co-host Alexa, to the other MPPs who are on this call. I want to thank Ben, who is a staff person of mine. He's been running Menti for us, and I would say it's been smoothless. And I want to thank Emma, who's been with me at the IPV committee and preparing all these questions, and of course, the agenda and the liaisoning with the community members. You can see on the screen how much the community members who are joining in the audience today want to do. You are all making commitments to advance the solutions. I'm not going to read them all out. I kind of like the one that says donate to the NDP, but really, thank you. But what I'm seeing is that people are saying, you're willing to step up and take action. You're calling on the government, pushing for more action. You're willing to give your time freely to organizations that are in your community. You want to come to Queen's Park to lobby the government for the recommendations that they may have put out in their report. And I think you want to take back the night. You want to raise good sons. That's right. Men, boys, all part of the solution. You want to advocate. And I know that this is going to be popping up as the night concludes, but I want to say thank you. Thank you for making a commitment to us and to yourselves and to your family to do more to end IPV. Thank you again to the speakers who really took some time tonight. And I want you to all walk away from this experience, feeling, I would say, empowered. This is not an issue that cannot be dealt with. This is an issue that has solutions, and clearly you and I, all of us together, are part of that solution making. Thank you very much, everyone. We are bringing this webinar now to a close. We said we would get you back into your routine at home or workplace, wherever you are. It is now 90 minutes off the top of the hour when we first began. And look at these answers. They're just exceptional. I don't know how you guys type so fast. Some of these are very long sentences. But thank you. Thank you. Stay in touch. We have all sorts of ways of staying in touch. We have started a conversation with a few more really important speakers on this topic. We'll be coming back out to you with a couple more town halls, but specifically focus on what can happen within the labor movement to end intimate partner violence and what unions and union partners can do. And also a very, very special town hall that is going to center even more Indigenous voices around IPV, GBV, and what are the community-oriented responses. So you can stay tuned because this conversation is going to continue from here. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening.